For more, we're now joined by Executive Director for NEDLAC, Lisa Seftel. A very good morning to you, Lisa. Thanks for making the time.
It's a pleasure.
Now, NEDLAC and MISTRA decided to host webinars looking at lessons and legacy of the COVID-19 pandemic for social contracting and social partnerships. What led to this decision?
Well, as you know, we are really winding up as a country, I think, our response to COVID and trying to integrate our COVID response into ordinary activities. And I think the social partners in NEDLAC felt that we should wind it down in an elegant way and learn lessons which can be taken to other areas of work, as well as see if there's legacies that can be left. Because although, there's no doubt COVID was very devastating for lives and livelihoods. But there was also a lot of lessons which we want to take forward in relationship to other areas of work, as well as ensuring that with future pandemics, we are more prepared.
So what are some of the lessons you've learned from the COVID-19 pandemic that can help us prepare for the future or for future pandemics? What structures have you put in place?
Well, in our webinar yesterday, we got a number of people, both who have been part of the response as well as external people, to reflect on what could be the lessons. And I think there are really 4 key areas. The first was about trust. Trust between people and government is really important. And initially, as I think you indicated, there were high levels of trust, but for a variety of reasons, of which David Harrison called contextual reasons, the trust between people and government did decline. And that is most noticeable in the fact that a lot of people didn't believe government messages and didn't adhere, to government calls to vaccinate. So building trust through bi-directional communication, I think is one very important lesson. The second issue is the need for leadership, but the need for leadership that acts and implements, not necessarily just says things. And I think one of the lessons, again, of COVID is that often there was a time lag between what leadership said and action that happened on the ground. As we know, again, that was a problem with the promise of vaccinations. The third issue that was raised is the importance, and remember, in NEDLAC, we have trade unions and we have community organizations, and for them really to be able to create behavioral change and so on. It's not only a matter of communication, but also of organizing. And particularly the person that represented SACTU, the South African Clothing and Textile Workers Union, talked about a lot of innovative ways in which they had reorganized so that they can respond appropriately to COVID and not be demobilized by the lockdowns. And then the last issue that was discussed was that was the degree of which there was consensus and partnership and collaboration between the social partners because there was this common enemy, COVID, and whether or not those lessons can be taken forward in terms of building towards a common vision in South Africa.
So most people found themselves out of jobs due to the pandemic. Do you think anything could have been done to prevent the massive job losses or minimize the impact?
Well, in the webinar yesterday, there was an acknowledgement of the terrible job losses. However, it was such a new situation, and that instead the focus really was on how to mitigate the problems of the lockdown. I don't think, and it might still be in our evaluation, that we would come to a call that we should not have locked down, but I think we all, there was a recognition that in a crisis, we all did the best that we can do. But yes, the impact of the pandemic has been very serious on jobs, and particularly on youth jobs, as I think you were referring to earlier.
So what's currently being done to help those who lost their jobs to go back into the job market? We heard this week of 2 companies, corporates in the financial services sector. Well, one of them taking back employees that they had fired due to refusing to vaccinate. What's the latest coming out in terms of cushioning people who lost jobs?
Okay, so I think, over the period of the last 2 years, there were a number of initiatives to cushion job loss. The biggest one, obviously, being the COVID TERS. It was a scheme under the UI for income replacement. And there has been, and there continues to be discussion, particularly, for example, in the tourism sector, about how do you pivot to be more resilient going forward. So, that, and then obviously there was the President's Economic Recovery and Reconstruction Plan, which also sought to rebuild the economy after the terrible job losses. In respect of the issue about vaccine mandates and, what you refer to now about companies firing people because they didn't take the vaccine mandate, in the eyes of those companies, I presume, in line with directions and a code of good practice issued by the Department of Employment and Labour. Those were the actions that they did as a result of imperative to keep their workplace safe and to improve overall productivity and safety. But obviously the situation has changed, and they have, for various decisions, felt that there's no need, including the fact that a lot of people are vaccinated, no need to insist on this. But obviously always, there are limits on our constitutional rights, which our constitution does make provision for.
Let's talk about vaccination. You were saying people were willing to adhere to regulations at the beginning of the pandemic. However, fewer numbers of people agreed to get vaccinated, with government having to introduce the Vuma voucher incentive. What do you think led to this resistance?
It's something that we are still talking about, because there was a lot of mobilization, and yet the mobilization didn't lead to an increasing number of people. And, especially towards, the end of last year, beginning of this year, it could not necessarily be because vaccines were not accessible. In the webinar yesterday, Dr. David Harrison, who led a demand acceleration task team, in his view, the reason for the drop-off was what he called contextual factors, which was also referred to as the overall levels of trust between people and government. And I think for a variety of reasons, that is low, and reflected also in a number of surveys by Afrobarometer, that ordinary people do not trust government voices.
Lisa, thank you so much for making the time to speak to us today. But before I let you go, I just want to ask you, you're the National Economic Development and Labour Council, not far from your offices in Rosebank, just across the street in Sandton. The President is about to address black industrialists and exporters. What role are you taking in this activation?
Well, specifically as NEDLAC, even though we're down the road, this is an initiative of the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. However, the issue of black economic empowerment and building black industrialists, and in particular, promoting local production and local procurement, is something very close to the hearts of the NEDLAC social partners. And I'm sure that there will be, I'm sure that, that is a place where both organised labour and community will be looking at and to be able to establish what progress has been made with this program.
Lisa Seftel, Executive Director for NEDLAC, thank you so much for making the time to speak to us this morning.
It's a pleasure.